Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level revision video. Today we are discussing the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Now, this video is focused on the AQA specification. As you can see, we have got the two key areas of focus AQA want us to know. So we'll be understanding and examining Aquinas' cosmological argument for the existence of God, thinking about those 10-mark questions. And then we'll also be evaluating his cosmological argument for the existence of God, as well as considering the argument's status as proof and its value for religious faith, thinking in particular there about our 15-mark questions. Now, of course, for AQA, our focus is on Aquinas' third way, on those questions about contingency and necessity. So that will very much be our focus in this video. If you are doing A-level RE with a different exam board, hopefully you will find some really interesting points, including evaluation points within this video as well. So you are also very welcome to join us. So do you know what I mean, guys? Get the notepad ready, get the post-it notes out, and also don't forget the snacks. I'm on the apple this afternoon, so make sure you're keeping yourself going. That's all I'm going to say. So let's get going, shall we? So in terms of our AQA A-level specification, here's where it fits in. So it's obviously on paper 1, and it is our cosmological argument for the existence of God. So what do we need to know? Let's start with some key terms. We'll then look at the key scholars, and then we'll actually get started. So very quickly, cosmos, it means referring to this space-time universe. Sorry, I really got that wrong, didn't I? Referring to this space-time universe. It is the study of the universe that we call cosmology. Okay, so if you are studying the universe, we call that cosmology. And of course, this argument is all about the universe. Why does it exist? How did it come into existence? So contingent beings, really important key term today. Things that are dependent on something else for their existence. They are contingent. In the cosmological argument, contingency implies the existence of something necessary, upon which everything else depends for its existence. And that, of course, Aquinas argues, is God. A fallacy then is going to be important for our AO2. A fallacy, such as the fallacy of composition, is a failure in reasoning, which is said to make an argument invalid. That will be Bertrand Russell's criticism of this argument. As our next key term shows us, the fallacy of composition is the fallacy of inferring, so of reaching the conclusion that something is true of the whole from the fact that it is true of the part. Okay, so it is assuming that what is true of the part is true of the whole. And Bertrand Russell is going to say, just because you can see that everything needs a cause within the universe, that doesn't mean you can infer, that you can jump to the conclusion that the universe as a whole must have a cause. Occam's razor then, another important key concept. It's a philosophical principle that having the simplest explanation is usually the best one. So I always remember this, the idea of it being Occam's razor, because it's about shaving off, yeah, do you get it? Unnecessary additions. And we'll look at where that comes in later on. A brute fact is a fact that has no explanation. And we're going to look at the idea that the universe's existence is just a brute fact. The universe is just there, and that is all, as Bertrand Russell is going to say. And therefore, we don't need to investigate the cause of the universe. Its existence should be taken as a brute fact. We'll look at infinite regress, another important concept, and this refers to an indefinite sequence of causes or beings which does not have a first member of the series. And of course, the whole cosmological argument is about the idea that there cannot be infinite regression. You must arrive at the uncaused cause, at the unmoved mover. And then finally, another key concept, the principle of sufficient reason. The doctrine that everything must have a reason or a cause, that every contingent fact about the universe must have an explanation. There must be a sufficient reason why there is something rather than nothing, and why this particular world exists. And we'll be looking at that in the context of this argument as well. Our key scholars then, who are the main men we'll be meeting today, and they are men, I have to tell you. We're looking at Thomas Aquinas, who is going to be the star of today's show. He is the main event, but we'll also be looking at David Hume, very important in terms of his critique of this argument. Richard Dawkins, who provides a really modern, contemporary critique of religion and religious beliefs. We'll be looking at Leibniz, as I like to pronounce his name, shares a name with those really nice biscuits you can get. You know, the ones with like chocolate on top and then like the biscuit layer underneath that are just so delicious and they just taste very, very high quality and expensive. That's him, sporting a great hairstyle there. Bertrand Russell as well will be making a few appearances, very important, as again a criticism of this argument. And John Mackie as well will be telling us why he thinks Aquinas' 5 ways do not work. We will also be meeting some other key scholars today, but I just wanted to start by introducing them to you before we get started. So another thing just before we get started is really important to refresh ourselves on the difference between an inductive and a deductive argument. So remember, the teleological and cosmological arguments are inductive. They are probabilistic. That means that the truth of their conclusions cannot be guaranteed by the truth of its premises, because you are using observation. And so you can never have 100% certainty. And that is something we know from science, don't we? You can never have 100% certainty, but it's probabilistic. Whereas a deductive argument, it does intend to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. If the premises of the argument are true, then the conclusion must be true. And that's what we talk about in the context of our ontological argument, don't we? The idea, if the definition Anselm has of God is true, if those premises of his argument are true, then the conclusion that God necessarily exists must be true as well. But just at the top of the session, a reminder, this argument is inductive. It's going to be about empiricism. It's a posteriori. It's inductive. You know, they are sort of your key scaffolding points about the argument. That's what it's built on, if you like, the method, the approach of the argument. Okay, so just a few pictures to get us thinking then. And the key question we've got to ask ourselves is, does everything have a cause? I think this is a good starting point for understanding the cosmological argument. And it is this idea that everything has a cause. So for example, really random, I've got a comb here on the desk. If I drop that, it hasn't just fallen, it's not just dropped onto my desk, you know, by complete chance, has it? There is a reason that has happened. I have caused that movement. I have put that comb into motion. And those images, you know, things like dropping a pen or somebody crying or a fire or a baby being born, all of these things we're saying, they absolutely have a cause, and we can observe that. And remember, this is an empirical argument. It's all about observation. It's all about working with experience and making conclusions, making inferences based on what we can observe around us. Now, the argument can trace its roots back to Aristotle, in terms of, he said, we do not have knowledge of a thing until we have grasped its why. That is to say, its cause. So we cannot claim to understand something until we know the cause of it. And so in the context of the universe, we can say we cannot understand the universe until we know its cause. So this key question, does everything have a cause? And then the question we're asking today, what would be a satisfactory explanation for the existence of the universe? So in other words, what could be the cause of the universe? And Aquinas is going to argue it has to be God. It is only God who has the DNA, or who has the qualities, if you like, to be the cause, to be the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover behind an entire universe. And we'll be taking a look at how he comes to that conclusion, how he reaches it a little bit later on today. So important to know, Aquinas presents 5 ways for proving the existence of God. So he's one of the most important people in the history of Christianity. We know him as one of the doctors of the church, and he's very famous for writing a text called Summa Theologica. He was very influenced by Aristotle. So we've just spoken about Aristotle and his idea that you need to know the cause of things. Aquinas was very influenced by him, not just in terms of cosmology, but also in terms of ethics. For example, Aquinas's natural moral law are very much developed from his reading of Aristotle. Now, in his text, Summa Theologica, which is called the sum of theology, so the totality of the study of God, Aquinas tells us his 5 ways that he thinks you can prove the existence of God. The first one is motion, the idea that God must exist as the unmoved mover of everything, because there must be an unmoved mover who has put everything into motion. There must be a reason for the motion we can see in the world around us. His second way is causation. There must be a cause who is the uncaused cause of everything. This idea that everything we can observe has a cause. And he says we must trace that all the way back to an uncaused cause that must be God. The third way is our focus for the AQA exam, and that is the way from necessity. And this is where we'll talk about the fact that all of the contingent beings and contingent things in this universe mean that there must be a necessary being who necessarily exists. And then also worth noting, his 4th way is about perfection, and his 5th way is about design. So his own version of the teleological argument there. And Aquinas uses the arrow and the archer analogy to say that things fulfill their telos, their purpose. Another idea that is from Aristotle. And he talks about the idea that there must be a designer who has intelligence, who is an intelligent designer behind the universe. So they are the 5 ways. And as I say, we're focusing on that 3rd one for the AQA exam. So as I've put there, our focus is on the 3rd way, which is all about contingency and necessity. So a quick reminder, this argument is a posteriori. It's made post-experience. It's all about seeing things, observing things, and then making inferences based on them. And the thing that he's seeing, obviously, is that everything in this universe has a cause. It is inductive. So obviously, we started by talking about the difference between inductive and deductive. It is an inductive argument, so it's probabilistic. It's reaching a conclusion based on your observations. And talking of which, it is based on observation. It's grounded in that observation. Everything has a cause. And so it's an empirical argument, which is going to be a strength of it because we live in this age of empiricism. We'll talk about this idea of epistemic imperialism, that in the modern world, we love to have evidence. We want to gain knowledge through empiricism. And so the fact that most of Aquinas's argument is rooted in empiricism is going to be a good thing. However, he does then make that leap, we could say, to concluding that the necessary being is God. And we could say that is a matter of faith rather than empirical fact, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. What you need to know for now is that way 3, the 3rd way, is his observation that all things we see in the universe are contingent. This is our key word, really. They are contingent, and that means that they depend on something else, a bit like a contingency plan. You know, if you have a contingency plan, for example, for if there's a fire, it means using that plan depends on something else happening, doesn't it? You don't just use it for the fun of it randomly. It depends on something else happening. If the fire alarm goes off, here is our contingency plan for what to do in that situation. So when something is contingent, it depends on something else. It is moved, changed, or caused by something else. And I want you to think of the dominoes. You may have watched, you know, the dominoes in your studies of the cosmological argument. The idea that those dominoes don't just fall on their own. They're all contingent, aren't they, on the domino before them falling over, and then you have that chain reaction of cause and effect. They do not need to exist, but they do. So they're not necessary things, but they do exist. And so we're saying there is a reason that they are moved, changed, and or caused. And this, of course, can apply to galaxies, stars, the planets, people, and trees, for example. So from his observation that all things in the universe are contingent, that they are moved, changed, and caused by something else, Aquinas concludes that therefore something, I wonder what that something could be, must exist necessarily. And he believed that that must be outside of the observable universe, because there is nothing in what we observe that can explain why contingent things exist. He therefore deduces, so he therefore reaches the conclusion that this external reason must be necessary. And of course, he's going to reach the conclusion that must be God. But your starting point for his third way is this observation. Remember, it's an empirical argument of contingency, of all these contingent beings that don't have to exist, but do exist. And so they are things that are moved, changed, and caused. And so there must be a reason. And Aquinas is saying that if contingent things exist, then a necessary being must exist as the reason behind everything. Okay. And he's going to say it is only God who could qualify, if you like, as that necessary being. So let's turn to our primary source, shall we? Summa Theologica, his text, his book. I say book, but it's like, you know, it's like as long as this room at least. You know, he was a busy man writing away. So this is from Summa Theologica. So here he is talking about this third way. He says, the third way is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be. So, of course, we've just said contingent beings are things that do exist, but they don't have to exist, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently, they are possible to be and not to be. So everything that exists, we can imagine existing, we can also imagine it not existing. So think of yourself. It is possible to imagine you not existing if your parents hadn't met, for example, at a certain place at a certain time and, you know, falling in love or whatever went on, you know. Let's not get into that. But the point is, you can imagine these things to exist and not to exist. A bit like a tree, you can think, you know, it didn't have to grow there, but it did. He's also saying here that these things have been generated, so they've been made, and they corrupt, they change. Over time, you know, things change. They decay, they get old, they might rot. We personally, of course, age, and that is a process that happens. There is change, and that shows that it's a contingent being. It's subject to change. It has a cause. He says, but it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which is possible to be at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. So he is saying that obviously because everything is contingent, then there must have been a time when there was nothing. Because think of yourself, for example, you haven't always existed and you won't always exist. And so there is a time when you didn't exist. And in the same way, there is a time when everything didn't exist. Yeah. So he says, now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. So if there was a time when there was nothing, he's asking, how did there end up being something? Because nothing can come from nothing. And that is a key quote that we need to know, that nothing can come from nothing. And this is something that Aristotle said, and it's something that Aquinas then agreed with. Nothing can come from nothing. So if there was a time when there was nothing, which there must have been, how did we end up with all of this? How did all of this end up rocking up and appearing? So that's going to be his key question. So he says, therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist, because if everything depends on something else, but there was nothing there originally, then how did anything come into existence, if that makes sense? So if nobody knocked over the first domino, none of the other dominoes would be falling down. So if there is nothing, nothing can come from nothing. So we've got a little bit of a problem beginning to emerge here, haven't we? And thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. So he says, if there is a point when there was originally nothing, then surely there would still be nothing now, because nothing can come from nothing. Everything depends on something else. Therefore, and here's your important bit, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. So this tells him, because that's absurd, there must be something which necessarily exists. And he says, but every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Now, it is impossible to go on to infinity with necessary things which have their necessity, I can't speak, excuse me, I've said that word too many times, which have their necessity caused by another, as has been already proved in regard to efficient causes. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God. Okay, just a quick moment to think about that. I want you to just read back through that text for me. Just think that final little bit. Therefore, from that point, just read back through that, pause the video and think, what does he mean here? What is he talking about when he's talking about this necessary being? Okay, so if we take a look at that last little bit there, we can see that he's saying there must be a necessary being that has not been given its existence, that has not been given its necessary existence, but instead is the cause of everything else. So this uncaused cause, this unmoved mover, this necessarily existent being, which Aquinas says all men speak of as God. It must be God. Now, we're going to talk about what he means by God later on. Some critics of his argument, for example, have said that Aquinas actually arrives at quite a deist view of God, you know, a God who is very impersonal and who just exists as this cause of everything. But so he is saying here, all men speak of this uncaused cause, this unmoved mover, this necessarily existent being as God. So we're going to start to unpack what that means and how he's got there in today's video. So here is the argument put down into a table for you. Okay, so premise one is that everything in the natural world, as we've just said, is contingent. Everything can exist or not exist. We know that. We can comprehend our existence and our non-existence. We can imagine us not existing. I mean, what a loss for the world that would have been, of course, but we can imagine that that is possible, that our parents hadn't met, for example. If everything is contingent, then at some time there was nothing, because there must have been a time before anything had begun to exist. If there was once nothing, then nothing could have come from nothing. Then we get to conclusion one. Therefore, something must exist necessarily, otherwise nothing would now exist, which is false. Okay, so the fact, and this is really important, the fact that this world exists tells Aquinas that there must be a necessarily existent being. Just that fact alone, the fact that there is something rather than nothing, tells him God must exist, that there must be a necessarily existent first cause. The fact that there is something rather than nothing tells him that, because everything is contingent, and that tells him the fact the universe exists tells him therefore something must exist necessarily. Now later on we'll talk about the critique that the universe itself could be that necessarily existent first cause, but for Aquinas he's going to reach the conclusion it's God. So if we carry on from premise 4, he says everything necessary must either be caused or uncaused, but the series of necessary beings could not be infinite, or there would be no explanation of that series. So there could not be infinite regression because there would be no explanation of that series. Therefore, he says, there must be some uncaused being which exists of its own necessity. This, he says, we all understand to be God. So he is arguing that God necessarily exists as this uncaused cause, as this unmoved mover. And again, he is saying that because there has to be this sufficient reason why there is something rather than nothing. We can comprehend that there could have been nothing because nothing can come from nothing. So there must be this uncaused being which exists of its own necessity, upon which everything else depends, which has started off the cause and effect. So this necessary being, he says it must be God. Okay, so another summary of this argument is from Gerry Hughes here. So this is a summary of the argument, which may help you to sort of get your head around it. So he said, nothing happens without causal explanation. A satisfactory explanation cannot appeal to something which just happened and was not caused. For example, a satisfactory explanation cannot appeal to brute facts. So Bertrand Russell later on is going to say the existence of the universe is a brute fact and we've just got to accept it. Gerry Hughes says that everything has to have a satisfactory explanation. Very similar to what Leibniz says about a principle of sufficient reason. There must be a sufficient reason. There must be a good enough reason, you know? So if you tell your teacher, oh, I've forgotten the homework, sorry, and they say, well, why? And you just go, dunno. They might say, that's not a good enough reason. That's not a sufficient reason. In the same way, we want a sufficient reason for things because nothing happens without a causal explanation. We want a satisfactory explanation. And so he says, the existence of the universe requires a satisfactory explanation. There must be a reason why there is something rather than nothing. And he says it requires an explanation outside itself. He says it is reasonable to think of this transcendent explanation as God. Okay, so he is saying that the satisfactory explanation of the universe has to be outside of the universe. It cannot have created itself, is what he's saying. Interesting, because David Hume is going to argue against that. David Hume says that the world is like a vegetable that could have grown itself. There is no reason it could not have produced itself and grown itself. You know, and the Big Bang Theory could suggest that, couldn't it? But he says that it is reasonable to think of this transcendent explanation as God. Remember, the cosmological argument is inductive. It is about probabilistic things rather than having absolute certainty. So what Hughes is saying here is consistent with the nature of the argument. It is reasonable to reach this conclusion. We are never going to have certainty, but it is probabilistic. It is reasonable, to use his word, to reach that conclusion. And that's what our inductive arguments are all about. Okay, so now I think is a great time for a knowledge check. If you're following along with the PowerPoint, then you may want to print this slide off and fill this in. Otherwise, just pause the video now and have a go at answering these questions. Can you define contingency? Can you define infinite regression? Can you tell me what the difference is between contingency and necessity? Very important, of course, for our cosmological argument. Third way. Can you tell me, what does Aquinas observe about the world that leads him to the conclusion that God must necessarily exist? And then can you tell me, why does Aquinas believe that God must be the necessarily existent first cause of everything? And I think this is probably one of the areas he gets the most criticism, this idea he's making the leap to belief in this transcendent creator God without any evidence. The whole argument's been about evidence, hasn't it? You know, we can observe everything must have a cause. And then at the end of his argument, he makes this leap of faith, to use a phrase from Kierkegaard, a key Danish philosopher, that is all about making a leap of faith. He's then jumping to something we can't observe, we can't empirically verify or prove, to think about the argument status as proof. So now we've done our knowledge check for AO1, I want to give you a couple of strengths of this argument. And I think the big strength we'll start with is about the logistics of the argument, about the scaffolding of the argument and its structure. And this is the fact that it is a posteriori and it uses empiricism. It is based, as we've said, on the observation that everything has a cause. Now, to be really specific, the third way is based on the observation that everything is contingent, by which everything we can see, we can imagine it existing as much as we can imagine it not existing. Everything we can see is caused, it's subject to corruption, it's subject to change. We can see that, can't we? So, obviously it's very sad to think, that our loved ones, we can imagine them not existing. It's very hard to think that way, but all the same, logically, we can do it. We can conceive of a time when they will pass away, for example, at the end of what we hope will be a long and happy life. But, we can observe that. And that's really important, that the argument begins with observation. It is grounded in empiricism. Why is that important? Why is that a strength of the argument? Let me tell you. Empiricism, as you know from your study of language games, is a popular method of acquiring knowledge in the modern world. For example, science uses empiricism. Harrison has a brilliant quote here. We live in an age where there is the epistemic imperialism of science. Now, all that means, really simply, is that empiricism has become the predominant source of all knowledge about the world. And so, as I've put there, the fact this argument is grounded in empiricism, therefore means it's got credibility, therefore means it may be, therefore means, I should say, it would be seen as credible, it would be seen as acceptable. It seems to have a good starting point that people in the modern world can get on board with, yeah? So that is a strength of the argument, that it uses a method of gaining knowledge that people in the modern world respect, that they accept, that they see as successful, and they think of highly. So it's a great starting point for the argument. Another point I wanted to add in there, talking of science and the epistemic imperialism of science, is that science supports the idea of the universe having a beginning. Yeah, the Big Bang Theory suggests there was a time when there was nothing. It's this idea that, you know, there was a point when there was nothing, and then suddenly things came into existence. And so you could say, again, there is this consistency with science. However, and this is important, this is where you can bring in a rebuttal in your essay to get that A star. You can say the thing that's not supported by science and not supported by empiricism is the conclusion Aquinas reaches, which is a pretty important part of an argument, isn't it? It's all going so well based on these observations, based on empiricism, where we've got consistency with science, and we're saying, yes, you're correct. You know, there must be an explanation. You are absolutely correct. You know, this must have a cause. Yes, everything does have a cause. Scientists are loving it. And then we get to the final stages of his argument, and he's going, and it's God who must be the necessary first cause of everything. And you're suddenly thinking, hang on, this is a leap of faith. You're making a leap in logic, a leap of faith. There is no observable evidence for that conclusion. So we can, you know, we can only say that it uses empiricism to a certain point, because it then concludes in the final part by going beyond empiricism. It becomes a matter of faith. So it's, you know, more like the ontological argument, really, than a matter of scientific fact, for example, because there is no observable evidence for the conclusion Aquinas reaches. So that's where you're going to get your rebuttal in there for your A star. Another strength of this argument then is that it does have contemporary support. That should say contemporary supported. Really great English from me there. Apologies. It has contemporary support from Father Frederick Copleston, who was in a famous radio debate in about 1948, I think, 1950, with Bertrand Russell, who we will meet later on. And he said this: in order to explain existence, we must come to the being, which contains within itself the reason for its own existence. That is to say, which cannot not exist. So remember when we read the primary source from Summa Theologica, what Copleston is saying in the debate is, you know, very consistent with that. He is backing up Aquinas. So he was a 20th century philosopher backing up Aquinas's ideas from the 13th century. So we have, you know, contemporary support. So we can see that the argument has retained relevance over the years, despite, you know, think about it, all the scientific discoveries in the meantime. We had a 20th century voice there backing up Aquinas. So that contemporary support can be seen as a strength. It shows the durability of the argument and the appeal of the argument, even in a more modern world. So he believed, Copleston believed, and said in the debate, it is only God who can be the necessarily existent first cause of the universe. So again, this idea, it has to be God. So he is backing up Aquinas there. He draws upon Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason as well. There must be this sufficient reason why there is something rather than nothing. And, you know, quite like what Gerry Hughes said, you want that satisfactory explanation, don't you? You're not content with brute facts, as Bertrand Russell was. For Copleston, there needed to be a a sufficient reason, a reason there is something rather than nothing. And to go even further, he said there must be a reason why there is this something rather than nothing. How did this particular world come about that is so perfect for human life? A nice link there to the anthropic principle that we spoke about when we spoke about the teleological argument, didn't we? So why this universe exists, that is his key area of focus. Okay, we're now going to look at some criticisms. Again, if you're following on with the PowerPoint, you are very welcome to print off the criticisms table, and you can fill this in as we go through. Otherwise, you know, make sure you're keeping hydrated. Make sure you've got the notes ready to take, got a few coloured pens as we go through some of those key AO2 criticisms, which are going to be brilliant for your 15 markers. So, it's Bertrand Russell's time to shine. I'm sure we're all very happy to hear. And this is where the fallacy of composition comes in. This was his key criticism of the cosmological argument. And he said that what is true of the parts is not necessarily true of the whole. So remember, this argument is all about observation. It's about observation within the universe. And then Aquinas used his observations within the universe to make a conclusion to make an inference, I should say, about the entire universe itself. And Russell is saying that's wrong, that you can't do that. You can't observe the parts and then jump to making a conclusion about the whole, because what is true of the parts, that they need a cause or that they are contingent, is not necessarily true of the whole. So just because things within the universe are contingent, that doesn't mean the universe as a whole is contingent and therefore requires a cause. So he says, and that's why he says the universe itself could be the necessarily existent being. Just because things in the universe are contingent, that doesn't mean the universe as a whole is contingent. He's saying this is a fallacy. So a fallacy, in terms of what it actually means, it's a failure in reasoning which makes an argument invalid. And the fallacy of composition is the fallacy of inferring that something is true from the whole, of the whole, that should say, excuse me, from the fact that it is true of the part. So, for example, if you think about H2O, which is water, yeah, we know that the parts that make up water, the elements, here's my little science moment, the elements that make up water do not have the same characteristics or properties of water. So water is H2O, isn't it? Hydrogen is not wet, oxygen is not wet, okay? Therefore, you may be justified reaching the conclusion that water is not wet. Well, obviously, we know that's not true, don't we? We know water is wet. And so it shows the problems of assuming that what is true of the parts that make up water are not wet, is going to be true of the whole. I think that's a brilliant example that is really concise, that will really show the examiner you know this fallacy. So hydrogen is not wet, oxygen is not wet. The hydrogen and the oxygen make up water, don't they? H2O. Using Aquinas' logic, you would reach the conclusion water is not wet. Well, that is incorrect, isn't it? So it's showing an example there of what we would call a fallacious argument, like that word. So he is saying that the argument Aquinas makes is guilty of the fallacy of composition, that it is a fallacious, maybe it's fallacious argument. Yeah, that sounds even fancier. Love it. Another example, all bricks in the wall are small, therefore the wall is small. Not true, is it? You could have a massive wall of tiny little bricks. Yeah. So it's these assumptions that you're making. You're assuming that what is true of the parts is necessarily true of the whole. Okay. So an example that Bertrand Russell gave is about mothers. So he said, every man who exists has a mother. And it seems to me your argument is that therefore the human race must have a mother. But obviously the human race as a whole hasn't a mother. That's a different logical sphere. And that is, of course, why we're seeing this as a logical problem. We cannot move from our observations of the parts, so of individual people, to a conclusion about the whole, about humankind in general, that all humans humankind must have a mother because each human has a mother. The same way, when we apply that to the universe, just because things within the universe have a cause doesn't mean the universe as a whole needs to have a cause. So his criticism is that the argument makes the fallacy of composition, and therefore it is flawed. We don't need to reach the conclusion that Aquinas reaches, that the universe must have a cause. And so here's what Bertrand Russell writes in Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Always great to refer to a text to get that A star. He says, the whole, you say, wants a cause. So he's talking about the whole universe. I answer that the uniting of these parts into a whole, like the uniting of several distinct counties into one kingdom, or several distinct members into one body, is performed merely by an arbitrary act of mind and has no influence on the nature of things. Here's the important bit. Did I show you the particular cause of each individual in a collection of 20 particles of matter, I should think it very unreasonable should you afterwards ask me what was the cause of the whole 20. This is sufficiently explained in explaining the cause of the parts. So what is true of the whole, what is true of the parts, excuse me, is not necessarily true of the whole. Yes? So you could have your 20 particles and I could explain to you the cause of that one, the cause of that one, the cause of that one. You can't then go, okay, and what was the cause of all of them? As he said with the mother, it's a different logical sphere. You know, you shouldn't be making that jump. There is no justification for making that assumption. And so you need to realize that even if everything within the universe has a cause or needs a cause, he's saying you need to realize that doesn't mean the universe as a whole needs one as well. What is true of the parts is not necessarily true of the whole. And that leads him to our key point that the existence of the universe is a brute fact. So this is our second criticism for the table. Bertrand Russell argued that the existence of the universe is a brute fact. It is a fact that cannot be explained or explains itself. So we don't need to know the cause of the universe. We can't know the cause of the universe. He said, I should say that the universe is just there and that's all. Now, that is a great quote to use in your essay. I should say that the universe is just there and that's all. Yeah, this idea that for humans, given our epistemological limits, if I can use a fancy term that basically just means the limits of our knowledge, the existence of this world, it must be treated as a basic brute fact that is incapable of further explanation. We just have to say the world exists. That's it. That's all that we can know. It is a brute fact. It is just there. Just because things within the world have a cause doesn't mean the world as a whole must have a cause, or the universe, excuse me. So those two evaluation points really nicely link to each other. And if you're including rebuttals in there as well, that really allows your essay to flow, doesn't it? Now, a response to this point is obviously from Leibniz and his principle of sufficient reason. We are not satisfied to just say something is a brute fact. We want to know, as Aristotle said, yeah, we are not satisfied until we know the cause of something. So everything must have a sufficient reason for existing. And so that could be a response to Russell just going, it's a brute fact. That's all we can say. He would say, I'm not satisfied with that. And so would Gerry Hughes, who wants a satisfactory explanation. Okay, David Hume then. David Hume has an interesting point. He says, why not the universe itself be the necessarily existent being? So even if you accept what Aquinas is saying about the fact that things in the universe are contingent, therefore something must necessarily exist as the cause of everything that has moved everything and put everything into motion, Hume says, why can the universe itself not be that necessary being or necessary thing? Why do you have to go one step further back to saying it is God? Why can't you just stop at the universe and say the universe is the thing we all understand to be necessarily existent? Without the universe, none of us would exist. So we all depend on the universe. Why are we saying that we all depend on God? Why do we have to go that one step further back? So David Hume says the universe itself could be the necessarily existent being. You do not need to go one step further back and say it is God. Now we can say that this approach is successful and better, you could argue, because it conforms to Occam's razor, the simplest explanation that avoids overcomplicating the argument by shaving off the unnecessary bits. And you could say Aquinas' jump to God is unnecessary. You don't need to do that. You don't need to go one step further. Obviously, for Aquinas, a man of faith, it was important that he did. He was trying to prove God exists, wasn't he? But you could actually say, if you don't already believe in God, you don't need to add that bit in there. It overcomplicates it. You go back one step too far. Shave that bit off and just be satisfied to leave things as they are, where they are, that the universe is the necessarily existent being. It gets rid of the need for God, and it just says the universe was the starting point. It is necessarily existent. Everything comes from the universe. It depends on the universe. He said, if something has to be necessary, why can't that be the matter which makes up the universe? Why does it have to be an unobservable God, which is, of course, a leap in logic, a leap of faith? And so why can it not be the universe, which we can observe? So it's still consistent with empiricism. Why do we go that one step further back? And he said that the universe, like a vegetable, could have created itself. So you'll remember from the design argument video that Hume says that the world is more like a vegetable than a watch, in that it doesn't need a maker. It could have grown itself organically. Now, a response to that, a rebuttal to that, always great for an A star, is that Aquinas believed that matter would be caused by a necessary being and would still need God as an uncaused being to cause its existence. He would say, where would matter come from? And he'd say, you need God to have created the universe, because it is only God who, by definition, can exist eternally. And so I would say that that bit of the argument goes beyond empiricism. That is about faith. You have to believe in God, and Aquinas' definition of God as eternal, much like with the ontological argument, this is our criticism, you have to play his language game. You have to be in that form of life in order for that to make sense. Excuse me, I'm throwing my green tea everywhere now, getting very excited. And so that is Aquinas' response, and there's my response to Aquinas' response. So Hume is saying it's the universe. Aquinas is saying it can't be the universe because God is the only thing that exists eternally, that can be the uncaused cause. But our response to that then is not a question of empiricism. That is a question of faith. Yeah, it depends on believing what you read in the Bible about God, for example. Okay, so then, however, another interesting criticism is this, and I think this is one of the best, because the whole argument, the entire way through the argument, is saying that everything has to have a cause. That is what the whole argument is based on, isn't it? It's saying, why is there something rather than nothing? Nothing can come from nothing. Everything has to have a cause. That is our whole argument based on what we observe. But then the argument concludes that there has to be something uncaused. God is uncaused. So if everything has a cause, which is at the core of this argument, then what caused God? So the cosmological argument is based on the observation that everything must have a cause, emphasis on the word must, how important that is because of contingency. But Aquinas then argues that there is something without a cause, God. So even if infinite regression is not possible, so even if there does have to be a first cause, and you could argue that actually is infinite regression possible? What do we see with numbers, for example? We have this idea of infinity in numbers, don't we? Correct me if I'm wrong, didn't do beyond GCSE maths. So why can that not apply to the universe? However, the point here is that even if there has to be a first cause, even if there has to be a necessary being, there is no evidence that is the Christian monotheistic God who Aquinas says it is. There is no evidence. And remember, we've just said a strength of the argument is empiricism, but now the argument is undermining itself by going against itself and the idea everything has a cause, and going against its empirical approach, because we're expected to believe that God necessarily exists because of the definition of God, that it must be God. But what if my idea of God is different from Aquinas's? So what if my idea of God, for example, is a deist like God, more like Aristotle's prime mover than his involved God, the God of the Bible, the God that we see in Christianity and who is worshipped by Christians? So you could say that the argument leads to belief in a different kind of God, belief in Aristotle's prime mover, but not in the engaged father-like God of Christianity. So Hume says the words necessarily existence or necessary existence have no meaning. So, you know, the words don't mean anything unless you are part of Aquinas' language game already. He argues that there is no being whose non-existence implies a contradiction. By this, he means the term necessary being does not make sense a posteriori. The words necessary being have no consistent meaning. Any being claimed to exist may or may not exist. So he says, and this is a critique we can use for Anselm's ontological argument as well, those words have no meaning. They're very empty. They are a matter of faith. You have to have faith that God is eternal, which is why it makes sense for him to be without cause. But empirically speaking, if we're being strictly empirical, there is no empirical evidence for this claim that God is the uncaused cause and that God necessarily exists. Theists, however, as I've put here, would argue it is only God who has the characteristics to be capable of being the first cause because of his omnipotence. He is eternal based on what they read in the Bible, but that is not based on empiricism. So it cannot be called a truly empirical argument. On that note, I'm going to have a bite of apple. Please do take a break yourself. You know, if you've got any questions about these, let me know. Here's the primary source. Excuse me. Very bad timing. Hume said there is an evident absurdity. It is absurd, he said, in pretending to demonstrate a matter of fact or to prove it by arguments a priori. Nothing is demonstrable unless the contrary is a contradiction. Nothing that is directly conceivable implies a contradiction. He says, whatever we conceive as existent, we can also conceive as non-existent. There is no being, therefore, whose non-existence implies a contradiction. So you cannot say that God necessarily exists. You can imagine God not existing. So you cannot just use the fact, well, God is necessarily existent, therefore he's the first cause. You can't do that. He says the words are empty. Obviously, this is a question of language games. This is a question of what form of life you belong to, how you use language. For a theist who already believes in God, then obviously, yes, they have faith in God as eternal and as necessarily existent. But does this argument prove to someone who doesn't have that faith that God exists? I would argue not. We're going to come on to that now. After, excuse me, one more evaluation point. This is so bad. Sorry. Done. Finished. That's it. Cheers. I've got my 5 a day. And now Mackie's going to tell us why the 5 ways do not work. Look at that. Little segue there. Sorry, just trying to buy time. So according to Mackie, John Mackie, who we know from The Problem of Evil and Suffering, none of the 5 ways work. He's not impressed. They don't work. They're flawed. And why? Why? Let me tell you. He says they either depend on some untenable medieval physical principle, love that phrase, or they just fail to establish the conclusion. For example, he says, why do we identify the first cause as God? And that is something we've asked several times today, haven't we? So he says on that note, and this is a great primary source, we have no reason for accepting this implicit assumption. He's saying it's an assumption. I've spoken about it as a leap. You're making a leap to a certain conclusion. He's talking about it as an implicit assumption. Why are we assuming it's God? Why, for example, might there not be a permanent stock of matter whose essence did not involve existence, but which did not derive its existence from anything else? So that is supporting Hume's idea that the universe itself, that matter could have been that necessarily existent first cause. But your key point here is, isn't it, that it is an implicit assumption, or it is a leap in logic, a leap of faith, that it's God. There is no empirical evidence for this. It cannot work as an empirical conclusion. You know, it's not satisfactory. It fails to establish the conclusion. It fails to prove the conclusion that God exists. But it also works with what he calls untenable medieval physical principles. It's outdated. It belongs back in the 13th century with Aquinas. It doesn't stack up in the 21st century. So that's Mackie's rather brutal assessment, I would say. So two things we need to look at before we finish. We need to know for the exam the status of this argument as proof. So I want you to think, you know, does it work for a theist? Does it work for someone who's agnostic? Does it work for an atheist? What do we think? So we could argue it does offer proof, because that shouldn't say Paley's. That's terrible. I do apologize. That is meant to say Aquinas's argument. Aquinas's argument is rationally and empirically based. His reasoning and appeal to observation provides strong support for theists. Now, of course, you could say all of that for Paley as well, but obviously we're talking about Aquinas. So yeah, we can say that it uses observation. Well, 80% of it does. Gerry Hughes, who we've met, says the cosmological argument is a more satisfactory explanation than the universe being a brute fact. You know, as we said, he doesn't like brute facts. He doesn't believe in them. You need a sufficient reason, as Leibniz would say. You need to have a satisfactory explanation. And he says it's reasonable to say it's God. So he'd say, yeah, it's reasonable proof. And the third way is one part of an inductive argument for the existence of God. Inductive arguments are valued for their use of observation. So again, we spoke about inductive arguments before, actually, didn't we? So we're saying, yeah, okay, we can get on board with that. However, how could you argue against that? Well, it's only deductive arguments that we can say give absolute proof. Now, obviously, in the modern world, there are very few deductive arguments. We do work with empiricism, but, you know, for the sake of a good paragraph in our answer, this works. The cosmological argument can never be absolutely certain. Now, we can never be absolutely certain about most things. Science never has absolute certainty. But as I say, it's a good critique. The argument, we could say, is unable to convince atheists. Instead, it can only offer reasoning to those who already believe in God, who already operate within that form of life, within that language game, as we've said many times. So Aquinas was a man of faith, and then he wanted to try and prove God exists. He didn't start from a neutral starting point. So, you know, we can say it only offers reasoning or reassurance or confirmation to a theist because it aligns with their understanding of God. That final bit of the argument is a leap of faith. It can't provide proof unless you already believe in his idea of God. And we could say, of course, on the flip side of that, a fideist, someone who believes that belief in God is through faith alone, would argue that belief in God is a matter of faith rather than proof. So you shouldn't be looking for proof in the first place. That's not what religion is about. It's a different form of life. It's a different kind of belief. And you could say this is trying to be too scientific. You should believe in God through faith alone rather than seeking to prove his existence. And then finally, I've alluded to Stephen Evans throughout the video, but to be honest, I forgot his name. It happens. And he said, this argument does not prove the God of Christian theism. At best, it points to a deist God. So you could say, you know, Aquinas was inspired by Aristotle. We come to conclude, or we reach the conclusion, I should say, that the world was created by a prime mover that Aristotle believes in, but not then the Christian God that Aquinas is trying to prove. So it does not prove the God of Christian monotheism for us. Final point then, the value of this for religious faith. Again, I've put Paley's design argument. This is terrible, guys. I'm so sorry. But I think these arguments will still apply. Let's hope. What can I say? Yeah, Pope John Paul II said that reason and faith, it was going so well, are mutually supportive. Yeah, so it uses reasoning. So faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. Paley's argument and Aquinas' argument is rationally and empirically based. His reasoning and appeal to observation provides strong support for theists, except that final leap, of course. We can say it is consistent with biblical teaching that in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, the idea that he is that uncaused cause. And again, that should say Aquinas, but it says Paley. Paley's argument gives evidence to support the belief that God exists. His description of the universe's causation encourages belief in God. Now, of course, it does not have value for a fideist who believe in faith alone. You should not try and prove God exists, so they don't like Aquinas' 5 ways. Aquinas himself did not actually think the argument was sufficient on its own, interestingly. So you do need to have faith as well. You can't just rely on these kind of logical, empirical facts, if you like, facts. You need to have faith as well. You know, things like the Trinity are matters of faith. they are mysteries. And so you need the biblical revelations and the teachings of the church and of Christ as well. And it says there, Paley's argument does not successfully address the problem of evil. I'd say the same for Aquinas. You know, if God is the cause of everything, if everything depends on him, then does that mean that evil and suffering have been caused by him as well? If God is the cause of everything in existence, that suggests he caused evil and suffering. And so, you know, what does that tell us about his omnibenevolence, omnipotence, and omniscience as well? That if he is the creator, the cause of everything, if everything depends on him, that suggests evil depends on him as well. So he could have, hypothetically, not have created it if he is the origin and source of everything. And that leads me to the questions. The only other thing I'd add there actually is you could bring in process theology, couldn't you? You could talk about process theologians and the fact that they don't believe that God created everything out of nothing, that God is the soul of the universe and that he's within the universe rather than being this transcendent creator of it. So actually, process theology might be a nice critique for you as well. Okay, so how would this look in the exam? Well, you could be asked to examine Aquinas' third way for the existence of God, or you could be asked to evaluate a statement, of course. You could be asked, Aquinas' third way argument fails to prove the existence of God. And so, of course, for that, you'd be looking to support him with maybe Gerry Hughes, Copleston, and even Leibniz, if you like. But then you would be bringing in the likes of David Hume, of Bertrand Russell, to really critique the argument and show why it fails, excuse me. Talking, of course, about that leap to the conclusion that goes beyond empiricism. I do hope some of that's been helpful. I do apologise for a bit of confusion with the PowerPoint at the end there, but I hope that has been helpful. Any comments, any thoughts, any questions, please let me know in the comments. All that's left to say is have a great day. Good luck with all your studies, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Goodbye.